Moi. Good morning, everybody, and I apologise for my presentation being in English, but I don't think you could stand my finish. I hope to leave time for questions at the end, so if there are any points that you need clarifying, then I hope to do so. I would like to discuss the partnership that can exist between the amateur service and emergency organisations and try and give an international view on the problems and issues that we face. In my role as IARU Emergency Coordinator, I deal with Europe, Scandinavia, the Middle East and Africa, all very different regions with very, very different issues. But there is a common thread linking them all together, and that's that in 42 of those countries, there are over 10,000 radio amateurs who are involved in some form of emergency communications activity in their communities. One of the problems I have in dealing with such a wide area is what is the definition of an emergency? Each of us will have their own personal definition, ranging from a personal injury to forgetting their wife's birthday. But this is not something that can readily be used for planning. In fact, the American comedian Mel Brooks summarised it looking at comedy, that if a comedian falls down the stairs, that's hilarious, but if Mel got a paper cut, that was life-threatening. So, here is a dictionary definition of what's an emergency. A sudden event, such as an accident or natural catastrophe, that causes great damage or loss of life. But that leaves a huge question. What is great damage, and how many lives should be lost for it to be called a disaster? Let's try the United Nations. Maybe they've got a better definition. 300 countries in the United Nations, more words. The United Nations says an emergency is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society with widespread human, material, economic or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Well, that's much broader a definition now, and what makes it interesting for some countries in Europe is the mention of economic losses. This is a major concern of a government whose credit rating may have fallen or they've run out of money. And maybe on a personal basis, if you don't have money to buy a beer at night, that could be a disaster again. But it's not really the kind of emergency or disaster that our people think of. It is, though, what our governments are planning for. This is much more what the image our people have of a disaster. Hunger, refugees, something a local community, which isn't us, can't cope with on their own. Something that absolutely makes the television news, that makes it a disaster. Something that definitely does not happen in your own countries. And a good example of this at the moment is Typhoon Haiyan, the ongoing disaster in the Philippines, which is something I'll keep returning to through the course of my presentation. But the practice is disasters do happen in our own countries. Real ones, not just financial. This is an image of flooding in Poland in 2009. And the truck's going over the bridge. Life is carrying on just as normal. The government is supporting the local community, and only rarely is help called for from outside the country. And the event does not make the news in the same way. Poland had serious flooding. The BBC coverage of this event in the UK was zero. Didn't even make the webpage. So there's also another reason for maybe this kind of event not making the news. National pride comes in. Some countries don't like to be seen to be vulnerable. Others, however, can't help but admit it. Some countries in Europe, like the Netherlands, with a serious threat of flooding to their country, make definite plans to call for help through the European Union's assistance and solidarity schemes. But in England, in the United Kingdom, our plans make no mention at all of asking for any outside help should we have a problem. Is this an issue? Are we right to be so confident in the UK? Maybe, but it would be far better if help was planned for so that everybody has been trained in what they need to do, who they need to work with, and how to work together, rather than try and learn all this in the middle of an emergency when lives could be at stake. This is a lesson that we have to learn in the amateur radio community, as well as our governments needing to learn it to engage with us. But how often does a disaster actually occur? This graph is used often, and on the face of it, the number of disasters, which goes there, if that's 1980, has gone up dramatically. Have we noticed this? Have you felt more disasters in Finland recently? Probably not. I don't think the world is really a more dangerous place to live, but we're just more aware of these disasters due to better communications. It seems wrong that at the moment in the Philippines we have countries sending their news teams over there with satellite trucks capable of passing back full live video of what's happening in an area. But our colleagues in the Philippines Amateur Radio Association are still having problems communicating within their own country, providing the relief direct to the people who need it because of a shortage of equipment as simple as a Pactor modem. One thing that has happened over the last 10 years because of the growth of that media interest and the television news interest is that the demand for information about amateur radio's involvement in disasters has really increased, and the reports that are coming out of IARU Region 3 at the moment relating to the Philippines read more like news reports providing an amateur perspective on the events rather than what we're actually doing on the ground to provide the aid and assistance. But if all these disasters are happening, surely more people are dying, and then we should be used more. Well, that's not happening either. This graphic overlays the number of people killed and affected onto the disaster numbers. And while the number of people affected has gone up, the number of people dying due to disaster is dropping remarkably. That's reducing because of the effect of better communications, making warning the public easier and providing relief efforts to where they're needed far better. So this is a positive benefit of communications. Looking at the graphs, you might think, well, is the need for amateur radio emergency communications decreasing? But I'd argue no, the need for our services has never been greater. We've just been lucky we have not been called upon more often. Because radio amateurs are part of their communities, they're very well placed to help in disaster. They have local knowledge, and in the case of organised emergency groups, they should have a good working relationship with their local emergency services. They've trained beforehand, they know the faces. This afternoon, for example, I hope you'll hear about some good work in Eastern Finland, where the local emergency group has got a formal agreement with the local emergency responders. This is the kind of thing that needs to be put in place before the disaster, because, as I said before, an emergency is not the time to start learning about each other. Amateur radio is entering its second century, its second 100 years of providing emergency communications. And listed here from the start, the United States had a flooding incident in the 1930s, which was the first recorded use of amateur radio in an emergency. The amateurs then provided communications not just to say a community needed help because of the flooding, they also passed messages for the news services of the day because the telegraph lines had been washed away, and the only way of getting news of the disaster out was through amateur radio. They also provided communications to the railway companies because the railway signalling had been washed away. So amateur radio provided services to the railway companies. Not a user we would think about now, but maybe we should. Personally for us, although I wasn't there, in 1953 the United Kingdom and the Netherlands suffered in flooding in the North Sea with several hundred people killed. This led, in the UK at least, to the establishment of the Radio Amateurs Emergency Network, our formal emergency communications group which celebrates its 60th anniversary next week. Before that, the government and the post offices had said amateurs had no role in emergency communication. But when the fixed services had been taken out by flooding, amateurs were the only people who could provide the communications needed for ships at sea. There was an earthquake that hit Mexico City in 1985. This was a major event for them and was dealt with locally, but it was also handled by some stations in the UK, who provided communications passing casualty lists so that people could find out who was alive, who was dead. Do we do that now? No, because that kind of information is passed by the internet. 2004 marked a big change in the restart of international emergency communications with the Indian Ocean tsunami, which affected a very wide area. And finally, the L'Aquila earthquake in 2009 reinforced for the Italians the very good relationship volunteers have with their government, who provide all their uniforms, training, paying for equipment they need, and so on. So are we supported internationally? Well, the International Telecommunications Union produces recommendations as part of the United Nations. The first one encourages the amateur service to develop robust, flexible and independent services. It also goes on to say these should be capable of operating from emergency power. But then it goes on in 13.1 to tell the governments that they should make arrangements to effectively utilise the amateur services in disaster mitigation and relief. We are a service that should not be overlooked because we can add value, we can provide communications when other systems have failed. Why would administrations provide the encouragement to us if they don't know what we can do or if they don't know the risks themselves? This is an education process for us as radio amateurs to tell them how vulnerable their systems are. And maybe we can do this by promoting some of our own emergency work. We don't promote our emergency communications activities as widely as we should. Many operations go unreported because the local groups do not think it's relevant to other people. Or maybe, as it is in Turkey and Italy, the response to events like earthquakes occurs so often that it becomes normal to them. British phrase, business as usual. But we should share information more widely so that we can learn from each other, because no event is too small to learn from. So how can amateurs help? Well, we provide a trained pool of volunteer radio operators, technicians and engineers who can use our great skills to augment disaster communications facilities. And we can do this with limited resources, as all our equipment and networks are self-owned. We're not dependent on anybody else necessarily. In some countries, this has become more and more important as emergency services communications have concentrated onto digital tetra networks, such as the Verva network here in Finland. Having all the emergency communications gathered onto one network is good to allow the police, the military and the fire services to work together in disaster response. But what happened in the UK when we developed our own digital system called Airwave, which came about mostly after the Lockerbie air crash of 1988, was that the contract to build this network went to a private company. And that contract, like any commercial contract, says we will give a service except in times of war, civil unrest, disaster, flooding, all the times when the network would actually be needed. So, how can we get around this? We're all volunteers. We have that flexibility in rearranging our communications to go wherever they're needed to be, not wherever the commercial people wanted them to be. We've got a wide range of frequencies to provide international communications or very local communications. We have our own repeaters. We have so many data modes. We can use high powers, low powers. We even have our own satellites, which reinforces that engineering capability we have. In some ways, as a service, we have too much choice, and that can make it very difficult to go to the professional services, the fire service and so on, and say, give us your messages, when we still have lots of internal discussions about what is the best data network to use. And we also have to be careful that we don't become a victim of other people's dependencies. So, radio amateurs built a global APRS network, the ultimate in a network which could be independent of the internet, past positions, past messages, everything our users might want. It's even included in nice handhelds from Yaesu and Kenwood. But as I found last night, my APRS handheld doesn't work very well when it can't get a GPS lock, and I have to spend a lot of time playing in the menus to override things. So what looks like a good independent system has its problems, has its vulnerabilities. The next and most important thing we should emphasise is the second point on this slide. We give our time and resources in providing communications to the communities when all other means have failed. We want to help, we are willing volunteers, and being able to say that there are 10,000 radio amateurs just in the Europe, Middle East and Africa region alone shows this commitment. But from a government and emergency planning viewpoint, we should never consider that our work is done. The threats to our population are changing, and it's not just financial crises. Just because something is low risk does not mean it will never happen. A good example of this is the meteorite that came over Chelyabinsk in Russia earlier this year. Initial reports had over 1,000 people injured by flying glass in the relatively low population area of Russia. What would have been the effect if this had happened in Helsinki or Tampere? What would have happened here? Who would have provided the damage reports? How many calls would have gone into the emergency services, flooding their networks with calls for help that needed filtering? In the Philippines, in the flooding, the affected people have used cell phones and social media like Twitter or Facebook to send messages after the typhoon hit. And to emergency planners, this is the new place to look for information. But these messages are very, very based on the view of one person. They're not formatted. Everyone needs to be looked at to see if it's the same event or if it's a new event. Is it from somebody who's buried or somebody who's heard somebody is buried and needs help? It's a lot of information that needs processing. In countries like America, amateur radio is used to gather damage reports in a very fixed format which can be relayed back to the emergency services. They trust us. The trust is important, that although the emergency planners could get those messages from social media, if they get it through amateur radio, it comes from a source that knows what to look for, provides the information in a certain structure that the emergency planners can use easily. There's something else we need to consider in what are called the developed or modern countries. So much of our technology and infrastructure depends on electricity. These electricity networks may be up to 50 years old, and some have been found vulnerable to changes due to weather. During a severe flood in the UK, one of our major grid yards started to go very nearly underwater. Engineers and the fire service had to work very hard to erect barriers and large pumps to keep the water out of the grid yard. Why bother? Well, electricity can't be stored very easily in the UK or anywhere. Supply and demand have to match. If the grid yard had been flooded, then the southwest of our country would have lost power. That's very bad for them. But for the rest of the country, losing that much demand would have made the other generators in the country overspeed and trip. And we could have had power cuts through the rest of the UK just because one grid yard in the southwest had gone underwater. Once an electricity grid goes down, it's very difficult to put back together again because supply and demand have to be managed. This is a process very like riding a bicycle. And remember how as kids you learned how to ride a bicycle and fell off so often. In Germany, they estimate that it could take 3 to 7 days to restore power to their country if they lost their electricity grid. That already seems like a long time, but when you think that that electricity supplies a lot of their heating, food distribution, water supplies, sewage and sanitation supplies, that could turn into an even bigger problem very quickly. Our German colleagues in the DARC are working with their government on a project where amateur radio may get involved in providing communications to places that the Germans are calling lighthouses, in the dark, somewhere that still has emergency power, where the population could go to get their food heated and get messages for help and medicines processed. They're realising that many systems depend on electricity to work, and the power network itself is actually dependent on things like the mobile phone system to provide the telemetry, the information to control the grid. The water systems in the UK used to have a dedicated radio network to control their operation. Now it's operated over the cell phone system, and the cell phone system is dependent on electricity, and the cell phone companies don't pay for a system to have batteries to last 3 or 7 days. A cell phone system will go down without power in 1 to 7 hours. That's not good when you're trying to put a network back together again. To some countries in Europe, the loss of electricity could be far more damaging than a severe weather event. We have to remember that modern communication systems, like all other systems, are built on older ones. So what do we do as radio amateurs? Do we build networks with diversity that operate on different power, like batteries, wind, solar? Or do we actually build resilient networks that say, well, if that network goes without mains, it doesn't matter, I'll use a different one? Actually, for all risks, we need to do both to meet the worst possible case. When mobile phones were first produced, there were problems with the lifetime of the batteries. The problems were gradually solved, and then the manufacturers started to produce smartphones, because let's make the phone do more, and we go back to the same old problem with batteries again, that I can't get my smartphone to last more than a day without needing a charge. All technology and communications and radio has always been held back by battery technology. And this problem relates to all communication systems. When something complex fails, you're going to need something simple and basic to act as the communications method to get the bigger systems going. So this could mean amateur radio being used to provide the messages for your grid operator, your power system operator, to send the messages to allow the switching to bring the grid back to life again. Because those power companies, what do they rely on? Oh yeah, mobile phones, or in the UK, some of them have satellite phones, which are a great way of draining batteries. Before you say this could never happen, remember that Europe is now operated as one large power grid. So for an event, when was this? Back in the early 2000s, part of Germany and part of France went off power because of a switching mistake. As a ship passed down one of the major German rivers, they turned off the overhead lines to allow the ship to pass underneath the overhead line safely. But because they'd made a mistake in communications across the two power companies, as they turned one line off, the power redistributed to lines which weren't set correctly, so they failed. And the whole power grid unzipped down Europe, peeled apart, with a lot of wind energy in Germany going unused, so they lost power because generation switched off, and a lot of consumers in France who were importing that energy from Germany going off power because it wasn't there anymore. That was a human error that affected two countries who would have thought before that their high voltage power systems were theirs and theirs alone. But in a modern era, it's not just human error we need to think of, but humans in the form of terrorism, because as more and more networks are computer controlled, they become far easier for other people to try and attack. But Europe is not immune to national disaster. We just deal with it differently. As I said, a natural disaster doesn't make the news in Europe the same way. Maybe it's the language barrier. Here's a picture of the American Hurricane Sandy, but not over America, but overlaid over Northern Europe. In America, this event was dealt with by one government, one language, one way of working. If you look at the overlay there, I make it about 9 countries, probably 10 or 11 different administrations if you put the European community involved, and probably more languages. How can support be coordinated when you have those many barriers of administrations and languages in place? Amateur radio, we do this every day. We talk to each other, we operate across borders. We also have, or should have, the benefit of the Tampere Convention, the convention signed here some years ago that allows the movement of telecommunications equipment across borders into a disaster zone at the request of the country suffering the disaster. That's a good start, but each country has built their own systems to do their own needs and their own risks. They may not interoperate with each other. There may be clashes. At the Global Amateur Radio Emergency Conference this year in Switzerland, we heard from a Swiss rescue group who are all licensed radio amateurs. They have radios which are fixed using crystal control, I think. It was hardly any control. 2 frequencies on 2 meters. And they will go anywhere in the world and expect to be able to use those radios. But what if that system actually affects the local amateur repeater, which is already passing emergency communications for those locals? That help has then turned into a problem. The amateur service can provide operators and can provide the intelligence to make other systems work together. We do need to plan and prepare to work and make that happen, though. There have been good examples of us doing that in exercises. I mentioned the Netherlands acknowledging European support. And in 2009, the Netherlands hosted a major exercise with players from all over Europe to get together. And communications initially was going to be handled by the military and a Tetra network. And within 2 hours, it had failed. And our colleagues in the Dutch Amateur Radio Emergency Service, who thought that they were just going to get some messages to make them feel wanted partway through the exercise, suddenly found themselves providing the communication for the military helicopters, telling them when they could take off, telling them where they had to go to, and the respect and admiration they got from the professionals went up like that, because they were ready for this, they knew what might go wrong. They were happy just to be there to get their faces seen and maybe offer a service, but to actually be used and do it first time was a great, great bonus. Disasters don't respect national borders. Disasters don't give you time to prepare. And disasters don't fit into countries' financial planning. A wide area power outage would damage emergency systems, our public, financial systems. Some countries, if we shut the Frankfurt Stock Exchange down for 12 hours, would have a serious effect on the German economy. In fact, if I remember the figure correctly, if Germany did calculate, as part of this exercise they were doing, that 430 million euros per hour would be lost if Germany lost power in total. 430 million euros per hour. And we were going to have Germany off power for 7 days. That's a serious impact on Germany. But we have other effects that aren't planned for. A volcanic eruption in Iceland in 2010 kept the European skies cleared of planes for days, leaving thousands of people stranded away from home and causing the UK to send the Royal Navy out to parts of the Mediterranean and North Africa to evacuate our people because the planes weren't going to be able to bring them home. So from a government viewpoint, they have to try and prepare for all risks, but they cannot afford the money to cover that kind of risk. But we are attractive because amateurs and volunteers are cheap, flexible, and we want to help, but we do need to be trained and ready. I want to move on to reinforce what we can do and the problems that we face. So we can provide that strong, decentralised, no single point of failure, resilient network. We can do that because we have the technology developed over 100 years and we haven't stopped yet. We can provide a basic network. We could also provide a high-speed internet replacement Wi-Fi network. But one of the challenges we have is in getting that network frequently used, so it's always capable of being there when needed. Many amateurs, when it comes to data modes especially, want to try and replace the internet. But if we look carefully at what's happening now, people are actually using services like Twitter and getting an amazing amount of information into 140 characters. about the same as a formal radiogram message that we practice in the global simulated emergency tests. So you can use basic systems, but then as the need comes along, build a Wi-Fi network. We can provide interoperability links between users of different radio systems. There are not enough radio amateurs in Finland or even the region to put a radio amateur onto every fire engine, every police car, every health service vehicle that may be needed in an emergency. But we can provide the high-level links to maybe more local radio services and provide the communications necessary to provide an improved response or the necessary response. And sometimes we have problems where the voluntary services, the voluntary agencies like the Red Cross, don't have good links into the professionals, into the military and civil defence. In the UK, the Tetra system was very expensive. And while the idea was that the volunteers would be able to get Tetra radios, like the Verva system you have here, we just couldn't afford it. It was 300, 400 euros just for the radio per year. You're not going to do that if you're not going to get called on to train and use it frequently. But amateur radio can provide these links, have one Tetra radio, take the messages, then use amateur radio to spread them to everybody else. But whatever we do, we have to stay within our amateur licence. And our amateur licensing is driven by the international radio regulations. And this is the biggest problem regulation we have in the book. Why? Well, it says that amateur radios can be used for transmitting international communications on behalf of third parties. But there is no definition of what is a third party. Is it a member of the public, or is it another radio amateur? And that's before it goes on to say that we can only do this in the case of an emergency. And you know how many problems from my earlier slide there are in defining what an emergency is. In Britain, amateurs could have passed messages for the thousands of people who were blocked at our airports during the volcanic eruption of 2010. But nobody did because we were not sure whether our licence allowed us to do so. And Ofcom, the regulator of amateur radio in the UK, because of how they're organised, cannot provide guidance. They have to ask their legal department, and a legal person will never give guidance. In Germany, passing messages for non-amateurs is prohibited, except if it's an emergency. And we go right back to the beginning again of what is an emergency. A disaster is not the time to rewrite the rules. We need to start looking at these kind of things early and telling our regulators what it is we might need and avoid the problem of having to apologise afterwards and say sorry rather than ask permission beforehand. This did happen in Britain in the Lockerbie incident, where amateur radio in our country is not allowed to operate aeronautical mobile. But the Royal Air Force needed communications with the search teams on the ground, who didn't have military radios or aircraft radios, so radio amateurs flew on military aircraft and operated aeronautical mobile. And we had to go to Ofcom afterwards and say, sorry, we broke our licence conditions, and we kind of got away with it. We were told not to do it again without asking for permission first. So this is what we learned. If you can get it right, the message we need going out to our users, the fire police, the ambulance, the governments, is that amateur radio can provide disaster relief communications. We've got the confidence to do this. And we can do this by taking non-urgent messages off their priority networks, preventing the overload. But it needs appropriate support and planning. The IARU tries to support this by providing a forum to allow national emergency coordinators like EURI, OH7JP, to share information with other countries, find out what problems are, see if anybody can help. Develop the procedures, or better still, the relationships that allow messages to pass between countries, and organise exercises to practice those message handling skills across national and language barriers. The biggest challenge I can see for amateur radio is passing a message in the Finnish language. from your country and getting it to the Finnish embassy in the United Kingdom without making a mistake. And it takes practice. And when I was reading about the Verve Tetra system, I found this quote about the use of the service by your health sector. It says, "Everyday use at hospitals is infrequent. In many hospitals, Verve's voice channels are not frequently listened to. As Verve is not used in everyday activities, its use may turn out to be difficult in case of a catastrophe, for example. However, particularly in such a situation, using Verve could be especially important if the ordinary mobile phone networks are blocked. An absolute precondition for Verve becoming familiar in the hospital sector is that the phone is in everyday use." And we could say exactly the same about the amateur radio service, because practice brings trust and confidence within ourselves and with our users. Started by SEPO, OH1VR, many years ago, the Global Simulated Emergency Test provides one opportunity a year to provide that kind of message handling experience. In America, they have a simulated emergency test every October. And I actually took the opportunity this year to get involved in that. And it was a huge shock to us in the UK, because in the global SET, we maybe get 50, 100 messages passed across the whole of Europe, Middle East and Africa reaching the centre. We had an American there who created 800 messages going out to North America and here into Europe. We got hit with 125 messages in one 2-hour session, which we then had to deliver by voice to other stations on the network. And this took practice. Our first message sent took 5 minutes by voice. By the time we got to the 5th or the 10th, we'd got it down to 1 or 2 minutes, and now the network was working properly. But in an emergency, we may not have an hour or more to try and get the system working. We need to go to our governments and our users and say, can we have your support? We need to get clarification on these licence regulations for emergency communications. We need to promote some of the international level agreements we have between the amateur service and people like the Red Cross. But for us as radio amateurs, any volunteer works best if they feel like they have a job and a clear job to do. Because even if we're not needed often, knowing what we're needed for and having training opportunities made available helps us keep amateur radio interest and keep in the face of our users. My final comment is about the Philippines. There's been comments made about why hasn't amateur radio been seen more as part of the emergency response, and why is all the news about what social media has done and what the broadcasters are saying, rather than promoting amateur radio as the only way people can communicate in a disaster. Well, this picture is from Philippines TV from a couple of days ago. It shows radio amateurs in the field in Tacloban passing emergency messages. It's the right point in time to pass that information out. But the amateur networks there have been very engaged in serving the public there, getting the relief supplies through. If they had set up networks asking for international users to send in lists of who was missing and who people wanted to trace, that would have collapsed the amateur network in that area. We have to look at an international response, not just in do you send teams of radio amateurs into a country to provide assistance, but a lot of the time the biggest help we can give is actually to let the local country manage their incident and give them the clear frequency. The Philippines in their update this morning continue to thank you all for keeping 7.095 clear for their emergency traffic, which is carrying on now and is likely to carry on for weeks to come, as their government, having seen them work in the first week of this disaster, is starting to give them more facilities, realising that the amateurs need power themselves and freeing up fuel supplies to allow diesel generators to operate amateur stations. Because in the first week, our colleagues in the Philippines have been seen as a professional service capable of delivering what their country needs in its time of greatest need. I could have used an image here from Japan and the tsunami, or L'Aquila in Italy, but the incident that happens now is the best one to take to our users and our governments and say, this is amateur radio today and in an international setting, not what we did years ago. For final point, as an international perspective, our biggest challenge is in not promising to do more than we can actually achieve, because our first failure will lose confidence and will never get used again. The second challenge is in communicating at events like this and saying what amateur radio can do. So with that, thank you very much for your attention and letting me speak here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, very much. One quick question.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking, while you were talking, of the breakdown of, let's say, grids. Shouldn't there be quite an emphasis on self-supporting systems? And I wonder how that has been dealt with.
Absolutely, there should, amateurs, to meet that recommendation, the question was how should we look after ourselves better in the grid failure. Amateur radio is limited by the battery technology, but we are getting some interesting work in Germany where one of the emergency groups there has actually gone into partnership, and there is a repeater in Germany using some very advanced lithium cells which together with solar panels will provide a repeater for that town which will last for the 7 days of emergency use. The challenge remains, if you have that emergency backup power, then you should test it and exercise it and use it. What can happen too often, and I suppose I do it myself, when I bought my shiny new Yaesu at Friedrichshafen this year, I actually bought a spare battery to go with it. How many people actually go out and buy the radio and then say, oh, I'll get a battery later? People do need to think, how would I respond? How would I keep my station on the air for a period of 24, maybe 48 hours? But then emergency communications groups, like the one being formed in Finland and becoming more formalised, can maybe hold some generators if they can persuade the government to part with some money, buy some generators and say, yes, well, the individual amateur might only need to keep his station going for 24 hours, but then the group will have had time to bring the generators out and organise methods of charging batteries, providing power to key stations. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and